Hey, welcome to Bio 100. Today we're going to do a lecture on global and regional climate and how this relates to biomes and niches. And hopefully you'll enjoy it. It's not a long one, so let's get started. So, climate. What is climate? Climate is the average conditions of a place measured over time and usually measured over many, many years. So, here's the truism here, though. There's never an average year, but there can be an overall average of years. So this is different. A climate is different from weather. So weather is really just the current conditions in terms of temperature, cloud cover, precipitation, etc. Whereas climate is the average of those conditions over many years. Generally, temperatures are warmer near the tropics than near the poles. Temperatures are usually warmer at lower altitudes than higher altitudes, and there's generally more seasonality near the poles. Water tends to mediate temperature swings. We'll talk about that a little bit. Rain and snowfall patterns are more variable than temperature patterns. So seasonality and precipitation are going to be influenced by the geology around them. And what I want you to do really quickly is hit the pause button, and I want you to look at this figure right here and see if it all makes sense to you, and see if you can think of an example of this as well. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to consider that and look at it. Can you think of where this might be that's pretty close to us, an example like this? Well, a lot of students are coasties, right? You guys are from the west coast of the United States, and as a result, this jumps out to you really quickly that this would be something like the Sierra Nevadas and the Cascades, and what is the result on the other side? So you have lush California, beautiful, warm, and generally lush, right? And then on the other side of California, because of the Sierras or the Cascades up into Oregon and Washington, you actually see that the other side becomes extremely dry, and that's called a rain shadow. So what happens is you have the prevailing winds, which bring in wetter weather off of the ocean, and as these clouds climb up and over mountains as part of weather patterns, they generally as they hit the mountains, they dump their water, making them lighter and able to actually move over those mountains. But as a result, when they get to the other side of the mountains, they don't have as much water to drop in terms of snow or rain. And so it actually takes them quite a while to build up before they are able to leave more water and rain on the continent. And we see this whereas California is very beautiful and lush, and you get to the other side where you get to Nevada, you get to eastern Washington and Oregon, which are all very dry, and this all together is known as the Great Basin. All right, so there are local factors that also influence temperatures, like altitude, right? You can think about when you go up into the mountains with your friends to ski or hike or camp or whatever it might be, the higher in altitude you get, generally the cooler the temperatures. There's also proximity to large bodies of water that can make a big difference. Characteristics of the land's surface and the vegetation, so whether you're in a forest or a grassland. Now here's the moderating influence of water. So water does it in several ways, right? You have the way that it will moderate in the summer and the way that it will moderate in the winter. I'm actually not going to go through this because I think that this figure is extremely self-explanatory, and I'm just going to let you work through it on your own. So hit the pause button and go ahead and do that. Okay, so there's a distribution of precipitation on Earth's surface. So rain and snow patterns, as we talked about, they're primarily caused by the sun's energy. So the rate of evaporation depends on the temperature. So high temperatures, things are going to evaporate quickly. At low temperatures, they're going to evaporate slowly. So at low evaporation rates, water droplets are actually going to clump together, and these groups of droplets are going to form clouds. As temperatures decrease even more, those cloud droplets are going to form and fall as either rain, or if they become very cold, as snow. Now I want you to just think about that for a little bit, right? Because you know that the higher in elevation you go, the cooler it gets. So as things evaporate, whether at high or low temperatures, the higher up in the air they get, the more cooling is going to happen. Droplets are going to clump, and then depending on whether it's very cold or freezing, you get snow or rain. So fresh water is characterized by low concentration of salts, less than 0.1%. And there are three general types of freshwater bodies. There are lakes and ponds, streams and rivers, and wetlands. Now, we're not going to dig into these deeply, although we certainly could, and it would be fascinating. But I want to focus more on the terrestrial environment. So there are influencing factors for biomes, and these have a lot to do with temperature, altitude and latitude, and precipitation. And if we look at these ideas as altitude, latitude, and precipitation, and we consider the primary vegetation type, that is what will tell us what the biome actually is. So there are four basic biome categories. There are forests, there are grasslands, there are deserts, and there are tundra. And so what you can do is you can look at this figure here, and as you get increasing dryness and increasing temperature, you actually get you can actually move to deserts, right? Or if you're down here where it's incredibly wet, right, and cool and coolish temperatures, in warm temperatures, you're going to be getting your tropical forests, temperate forests, boreal, and tundra even, depending on how cool it gets with the increasing dryness. So I want you to just take a second, look at this figure, hit the pause button, make sure it makes sense to you. Okay, and so if we look at these biomes, there's actually more biomes than tundra, grassland, or forest. A lot of the forest biomes are actually broken out into being boreal, temperate, tropical, or even mountain. But we're only going to focus on the four: tundra, desert, grassland, and forest generally. Nonetheless, I want you to be aware that there are some other biomes that we could investigate spread around the world. So forest biomes, these are vegetation communities that are dominated by trees and other woody plants. Okay, so forests account for about a third of Earth's land mass. They contain about 70% of Earth's biomass. So this is all of the weight of the biology on Earth, all the mass is found in 70% of it's found in forests. There are three general types, as we talked about already in the previous slide. There are tropical, these are ones that are generally at or near the equator. Temperate, which are 23 to 50 degrees north and south of the equator, and then boreal, which are the forests closer to the poles. Grasslands have very few trees or shrubs. There's not enough rain to support trees. The plants that live there have to be able to get the water, have to be able to have a fairly short green to seed life cycle, and they need to be able to maximize the amount of the rain they get out of the very top layers of the soil. So deep root systems aren't an advantage here. There are tropical grasslands, which we call savannas, and there are temperate grasslands, which we call prairies. Grazing favors grasses and plants that grow from the base, since grazers eat the tips of the plants, and grasslands are typically maintained by periodic burning. This is natural burning. Here you see individuals setting the fires, but grasslands in general burn quite often. Okay, deserts. So these are areas where rainfall is less than 50 centimeters per year. The temperatures can fluctuate. Deserts can be very cold, and just think about where we live. We live in a desert now, right? They can also, of course, be very hot, and oftentimes they fluctuate between being very cold and very hot. There's typical plant communities there. These plants have waxy coating spines, column-like, and there's water storage systems. So you can think of cactus, right? That's a very typical plant in this type of environment. And then the tundra. So this is plant growth that's sustained for a very short amount of time, around 2 months out of the year. They have a permafrost or an icy mud that is underneath the topsoil later. And this is actually what impedes water drainage and tree growth. So trees can't actually grow very well in tundra because there's too much icy mud for the roots to go into. Plants are typically ground hugging. There's high winds here, low temperatures, and again, the permafrost, which we talked about. And then with climate change, some areas of tundra are actually starting to convert to boreal forest as the permafrost subsides. So I want you to hit the pause button here and see if you can identify the different biomes from these pictures. Okay, hopefully you took the time to do that. Hopefully it all made sense. Reach out to a TA if it doesn't, or if you're unsure. Okay, let's talk about niches. So every species occupies a niche in a biome. A niche is the role that a species plays, essentially. So it includes the type of food they eat, where they live and reproduce, and the relationships to other animals. So here's a really cool example from these birds. So these are three very closely related birds. They're all warblers. And when you look, there's three different species here. And when you look at how they feed and even reproduce, they maximize their time. They maximize their niche by feeding in different parts of the tree overall, which is absolutely fascinating, right? So you have the Cape May warbler, which feeds on the tips of branches near the tops of the tree. You have the bay-breasted warbler, which feeds in the middle part of the tree. And then you have the yellow rumped warbler, which feeds on the lower part of the tree and at the base of the middle of the branches. So each one of these birds has almost certainly speciated to maximize their feeding strategies and their niche in the different parts of this spruce tree. I want to emphasize this: niches are powerful, and we know this from a lot of different examples, but one that might be more easy for you to follow and think about are those of what we call eutherian mammals. So these are mammals without pouches. They're not marsupials. Okay, so these have evolved outside of Australia, and what you'll see is that we have mammals that feed on ants. We have mice and their roles, ocelots, wolves, deer mice, moles, flying squirrels, right? We have this whole diversity of other mammals that have evolved in the world that are not marsupials. But what's fascinating is that as mammals moved into Australia, and these are marsupials that moved there, you have the equivalent of each one of these animals as marsupials, and all of these having pouches, right? These all occupy the same niches. And what's fascinating is that these Australian niches actually drove very similar morphologies and anatomies and even overall looks to mammals that evolved in other parts of the world. Okay, so let's talk about trophic levels. We talked about this a little bit last time, but essentially you have your producers, your primary consumers, your secondary consumers, tertiary and quaternary consumers, and it could even go higher, right, if there's something that's going to feed on this hawk up there. And so what you want to think about this as is, where in this structure do most animals land that you can think about, and how are they contributors to these trophic levels that we see in the food webs that we looked at last time. So here's some examples. So if we look at a grassland biome, right, the primary producer is going to be grass. The primary consumer is going to be the grasshopper. Secondary consumer is going to be a rat that may actually feed on both the grass and the grasshoppers. Snake would feed on the rat. A hawk would feed on the snake, right? You can go to the pond biome. We didn't talk a lot about freshwater, but it's important to think about it. You can have algae as the primary producer. Mosquito larvae could be the primary consumer as they feed on algae. Dragonfly larvae are going to feed on the mosquito larvae, fish on the dragonflies and the mosquitoes even, and then the raccoon would feed on the fish. And then the ocean biome, right? You can kind of sort that one out on your own. Now, what I want you to do is think about, from what you know about deserts, forests, and tundra, what might be some of the animals that might make up these trophic levels in those different biomes. And that's where we're going to end it today. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Hope you're having a good time and everything's going well for you in the course. And we're almost there. We're getting close.